I want to start with the part of this crisis that looks boring on television, not the missiles in the street, not the speedboats in the Strait of Hormuz, not the footage of masked men boarding ships that had nothing to do with America. The most important thing that happened was a plane that never moved. Air Force Two was ready. Vice President Vance was supposed to fly to Islamabad for the second round of talks. Pakistan had prepared the channel. The diplomatic atmosphere, according to people close to the process, was the best it had been since the war began. And then the plane stayed on the runway. That is the whole story in one image. A superpower was ready to negotiate. A mediator was ready to host. The world was ready to see whether this war could move from blockade to settlement. And the country on the other side could not produce a government that was still allowed to speak. The headline says, Iran rejected peace. That is too simple. A normal government rejects peace because it wants better terms. A normal government rejects peace because it believes it has more leverage. A normal government rejects peace because it is still bargaining. This was different. What happened inside Tehran was not bargaining. It was a command seizure. The civilian figures who still had an interest in negotiations were pushed aside. The National Assembly Speaker, the President, and the Foreign Minister. The three men who could still argue that Iran needed an exit before the blockade destroyed the economy were suddenly no longer the voice that mattered. The IRGC moved. Its media arm announced that negotiations were a waste of time. The trip collapsed before it began. That is not diplomacy failing. That is diplomacy being taken hostage by the armed faction that benefits most from war. And once you see that, the entire conflict looks different, because the real question is no longer whether Iran will accept America's offer. The real question is whether anyone in Iran is still powerful enough to accept anything at all. That is what Washington is now testing. Not Iran as pride, not Iran as rhetoric, not Iran as ability to put missiles on trucks and parade them through Tehran. Washington is testing whether the Iranian state still has a center, and the tool being used to test it is not another bombing campaign. It is time. This is the part that many people misunderstand about the ceasefire extension and the blockade. They see Trump not bombing and think he is waiting. They see the ceasefire staying in place and think Washington has softened. They see the talks canceled and assume America lost momentum. I think the opposite is happening. The IRGC just gave Washington the one thing Washington needed most. It gave Washington a reason to stop treating Tehran like a normal negotiating partner and start treating it like a machine that has to be starved until its internal gears grind against each other. That is the patience inversion. Before the talks collapsed, time was dangerous for Washington. Oil prices were high. Gas prices were political. Domestic pressure could build. Allies could grow nervous. The White House needed a deal, or at least the appearance of progress. After the IRGC blew up the talks, time became dangerous for Tehran, because now the blockade is not just leverage for a deal, it is a pressure test on the group that stopped the deal. And that group has a very specific weakness. It needs cash. The IRGC can survive speeches. It can survive international condemnation. It can survive bad press. It can even survive more damage to facilities. It has already learned to replace or hide. What it cannot survive indefinitely is running a military state without revenue. That is why Kharg Island matters more than the propaganda videos. Kharg is small, but economically it is the throat of Iran's oil system. Roughly 90% of Iranian oil exports pass through that tiny island. When the blockade and war risk insurance make tankers stay away, the problem is not just that oil cannot leave. The problem is that oil keeps coming out of the ground with nowhere to go. Storage fills, floating barrels pile up, tank farms become clocks, and when the clock runs out, Iran has to shut in wells. That phrase sounds technical, but the consequence is political. Shut in the wells. And production does not simply pause like a light switch old. Fragile fields can be damaged, water can seep into the system, output can be permanently reduced, restarting costs money, expertise, and confidence. Three things Iran does not have in abundance right now. So while the IRGC celebrates in the street, the oil system is quietly asking a much colder question: where does the next dollar come from? That is why the blockade is more dangerous to the IRGC than another night of bombing. Bombing gives the IRGC a story. A blockade gives it a payroll problem. Bombing lets the hardliners say, the enemy is attacking us. Fall in line. A blockade forces soldiers, police, port workers, refinery crews, and provincial commanders to ask whether they are going to be paid. That is not a media problem. That is a regime control problem. Every armed system is built on loyalty, fear, ideology, and money. The IRGC still has fear. It still has ideology. It still has weapons. But the blockade is aimed at the money. And once the money weakens, the other three start behaving differently. Fear works when people believe the center is strong. Ideology works when people believe sacrifice has a destination. Weapons work when the people holding them believe the commander above them can still protect and reward them. But if oil stops moving, salaries become uncertain, local commanders start improvising, and civilian officials are locked out of power. The system no longer looks strong. It looks trapped. That is why the IRGC's ship seizures matter, but not in the way they think. Iran attacked and seized ships that were not American, that was not random, that was a choice. They avoided the one target that would guarantee a full American response, and they hit vessels connected to countries they believed would create diplomatic noise. That is not strength, that is calibration. It tells you Iran still fears the American line. If the IRGC believed it had escalation dominance, it would not be filming itself boarding neutral ships while avoiding American assets. It would challenge the force imposing the blockade directly. Instead, it is trying to create pressure sideways, hit a Greek-linked ship, hit a UAE-linked vessel, threaten Gulf civilians, post warnings, create images, feed the narrative that Iran is not boxed in, but this is where the strategy begins to fail. Because every neutral ship Iran hits becomes one more reason for neutral governments to move away from Iran, not toward it. The Gulf states have been trying to stay out. They do not want their ports, gas facilities, desalination plants, airlines, tankers, or financial centers dragged into this war. Many of them have avoided giving Washington everything it wants because they understand the cost of being seen as launch pads against Iran. But when Iran threatens those same countries anyway, Tehran destroys the very neutrality it needs. That is the mistake. Iran is trying to make the war too expensive for America, but by attacking third parties, it may make Iran too dangerous for everyone else. And that changes the diplomatic environment. A neutral country can pressure Washington to de-escalate if it believes Washington is the source of risk. But if Iran is the one shooting at ships and warning civilians to leave Gulf countries, those same governments begin to see Washington as the insurance policy, not the problem. The IRGC thinks it is widening the pressure. It may actually be widening the coalition against itself. Now connect that to the internal power struggle. The IRGC needs a state of war because peace would expose it. Peace would force negotiations over the nuclear program. Peace would revive the civilian government. Peace would ask who mismanaged the war, who dragged the economy to the edge, who lost control of the ports, who let the oil system become a hostage to the blockade. War protects the IRGC from accountability. So the IRGC must keep war alive, but the blockade makes war financially harder every day. That is the trap. The armed faction needs conflict to remain dominant, but the conflict is cutting off the revenue that allows it to remain dominant. That is why last night was not a victory for the hardliners. It was a confession they had to stop the talks because a real negotiation would weaken their internal position. But by stopping the talks, they made sure the blockade continues, and by making sure the blockade continues, they increase pressure on the exact money machine that keeps them in power. This is how military factions often miscalculate. They see control of the palace and mistake it for control of the country. They see the ability to arrest civilian officials and mistake it for the ability to run an economy. They see the ability to seize a ship and mistake it for the ability to break a blockade. Those are not the same thing. A government can be captured in a night. An economy cannot be fed by slogans. An oil system cannot be restarted by speeches. And an unpaid armed force does not remain disciplined forever. So where does this go? I think there are three signals that matter now, and none of them are the loudest headlines. The first signal is whether Mojtaba Khamenei appears publicly and speaks clearly. If he does, that means someone has either restored or manufactured a center of authority. If he remains hidden, the world will assume the IRGC is the only real command structure left. The second signal is whether reports of unpaid forces grow from scattered complaints into a pattern. One unpaid unit is noise. Many unpaid units across different provinces is the beginning of a loyalty crisis. The third signal is whether Iran crosses from attacking third-party vessels to attacking an American asset. That is the red line that turns patience back into firepower. Until then, Washington's strongest move may be not to move. That sounds strange, but it is the logic of this moment. If America bombs immediately, it gives the IRGC the clean external enemy it wants. If America waits while keeping the blockade tight, it forces the IRGC to explain why the economy is dying after the hardliners claimed they had saved the country from surrender. The IRGC thinks it prevented capitulation, but it may have prevented the only exit that could have saved its own system. That is why the plane on the runway matters. Air Force 2, not leaving. Andrews was not just a diplomatic cancellation. It was the moment the war moved from a negotiation over terms to a test of who inside Iran can still control the consequences of saying no. And if nobody can control those consequences, then the blockade does not have to defeat Iran from the outside. It only has to wait long enough for the people trapped inside the system to start asking the question every fragile regime fears: who is really making us suffer? The enemy outside, or the men with guns who will not let the country choose a way out?